Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of ArkFest 2026. My name is Rob Buckton. I'll be your host today. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. All participants will be muted, except for obviously the speaker. The sessions are recorded, so you'll be able to go back and review anything if you need. And recordings will be available in the conference lobby and will remain accessible until the end of August. We will have Q&A at the end, so I would encourage everyone to post questions either in the Q&A function or in the chat as we go through, and I will then collate the questions and then I'll present them to Ricky as we go through. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Ricky Lakhani, and today's presentation is from TMF Bottleneck to Seamless Flow, Interoperability in Action. Over to you, Ricky.
Perfect. Thank you, Rob. Good morning, everybody. So as Rob said, my presentation today is focused on interoperability and thinking about the TMF, thinking about archiving, and thinking about all the different systems that we use that interoperate with the TMF. So we hear a lot that the TMF is often treated as passive and a retrospective digital filing cabinet. A place where we send documents to simply go and rest once the actual work is done in order to actually collect them. But as our architectures grow and they get more complex, the siloed approach of thinking of the TMF in that way is not really sustainable. So my objective today is to explore how we move beyond that thinking and the concept of a static repository. Not just in the words of acknowledging that we have a problem that we need to deal with, but also in thinking about how do we harmonize our broader clinical systems through true interoperability and real-time data flow, and how do we transform our trial master file into a central command center of health, and then how do we then think about being archive ready but in terms of the design of our clinical system ecosystem. So how do we turn the idea of long-term archiving from something that's quite stressful towards the end of the study into something that's a bit more seamless and almost an automated non-event, shall we say. And so if we're going to understand how we can achieve this, we have to look at where we are getting stuck today. And so we have to dismantle in what I call the passive repository trap. But before we do that, just a brief introduction to myself. So I'm Ricky Lakhani. I'm the Chief Product Officer at PHARMASEAL, and I lead the strategic development of our Agility Trial Management platform. I've been in the industry for over 20 years, and I sit in the intersection of the business side of life sciences and technology. So I've held various leadership positions at organizations such as Amgen, Roche. So I've actually been on the business side, and then on the vendor side, previously with Medidata and then with PHARMASEAL for almost 8 years now. And so my career has really been focused on how do we break down silos within the clinical domain through unified digital architectures, systems, and how do we get systems to talk to each other in a more interoperable way. And that's what really brings me here today to speak with you. In terms of my presentation today, all the views in here are my own, and so let's just have some standard disclaimers for you on this slide. Forward, there we are. Okay, so the TMF itself, it is, as I say here, the pulse of your clinical trial health. When we look at the current regulatory landscape, inspection readiness, it shouldn't be a mad scramble, either at the end of the study or even in between when an inspection is coming up. It should be and has to become more continuous. And this is why I refer to the TMF here as the pulse or the heartbeat of your clinical trial health, because if your TMF is healthy, if records management is being kept up with the activities of the study, then your TMF is considered to be healthy. But if it's flatlining or lagging weeks behind, what is actually happening is that your trial is exposed to much more risk. So to maximize the value of our technology, we've got to transition our mindsets. Yes, we need the technology to evolve. We need our vendors to support us in this, but we also need to transition our mindsets as operational people. So we need to think of the TMF and study archiving not as an afterthought, but treat it as a proactive study management tool. We need to ensure that our documents and our records are more naturally flowing from clinical operations, and then from the actual clinical operations, not from the functional function itself, but from our actual clinical operations, and the completeness of our TMF, timeliness become the leading indicators of the performance of our clinical trial. It allows us then to spot compliance bottlenecks before they jeopardize us in terms of an inspection. Now, this shift in mindset requires us to have a clear understanding of where we stand today and then where we are heading. So with that, let's look at the TMF from a maturity perspective. So to me, it's kind of crazy to think that we can still talk about an era of paper binders, especially as they still exist in some instances. Now, what's actually happened over the years is we've eventually digitized the concept of the paper binder, and that is kind of what you see on the far left of the slide. And I refer to that as the retrospective TMF. This is where it's categorized really by the fact that we are manually tracking things. It's very focused on document collection. And then it's also, requires us to do quite a lot of firefighting before we get into an audit situation. Today, we find ourselves, sort of in the middle column, what I like to refer to as the proactive TMF. We have systems that are integrated. We're tracking metrics in more real time, and we're using more data to drive compliance. However, if we look to the horizon in this year and then the years to come, in some respects, where we are right now is that we are already entering the far right, this era of what I call here the agentic TMF. Now, don't worry if that term sounds overly technical. In simple terms, it really just means that we're moving from systems that store information and to systems now that are more intelligent, that can actively assist us in our day-to-day lives. So imagine now a TMF system that doesn't wait for you to upload a document, but can actively communicate with the other systems. It can flag what's missing. It can self-correct any minor indexing errors. It can maintain some of its own health. It's kind of scary to think about in some instances, but it's actually very, very exciting as well. So if we're going to move into this proactive, intelligent future, we've got to first now address the foundational plumbing of our clinical trials, the integration of our clinical systems ecosystem. So in our typical clinical architecture, we have excellent specialized systems. We've got EDC for managing the patient data or electronic data capture. You have CTMS, your clinical trial management system for tracking and managing your operational milestones and study progress. You've got regulatory information management systems or RIM to handle your submissions. And as you can see from this slide, there are many other systems, and I couldn't even fit them all on there to make this a somewhat readable slide. But there are so many other systems in there that you are using during the course of your clinical trials. The problem that we've historically had, and to an extent we still have, is these systems can still live in isolation. And so whilst it's great that we have technology systems for these processes, we still have systemic gaps, misalignment in the nomenclature, in the metadata, and therefore we still have duplicate entry taking place across these different systems. So let's take an example where a site monitor puts in their monitoring visit in the CTMS. We should already have an expectation in the TMF that there are documents or records cut inbound. So, if the site visit has been created, then there should be an expectation in the TMF for a monitoring visit report or the follow-up letter. Or, if you have an approved regulatory submission in your RIM system, we should have that mirroring then into the TMF without necessarily needing a human to download a PDF or a document or a record in another format and then upload it somewhere else. By connecting these systems, we eliminate some of the manual tracking, and we ensure that our data flows more seamlessly. And we are seeing this with some technologies already, but integrations and interoperability can still be very costly, can still be very time consuming, depending on the systems that you're using, the vendors that you're working with. Now, it probably seems that I'm talking a little bit of a blue sky, a nirvana that could sound really exciting. All these systems talking to each other, reducing our duplication, us introducing artificial intelligence to provide more automation. But it's also worth us noting that all of that is great and a good goal to strive towards. But what are the regulators saying? And what do we need to be mindful of before we jump into trying to achieve this goal and working with our vendors to achieve this goal as well? How do we ensure that we are still compliant with what the expectations of the regulators is? So some might look at interoperability and think that it is an IT project. It's a technology nice to have. But as product managers, as clinical leaders, we have to look at the fact that modern regulatory expectations are making our old school manual disconnected processes a huge compliance risk. So whilst there is a fear and a cost to moving towards this technology-driven interoperable state, we have to be aware that the regulators are starting to expect this, and that if we don't start this journey and don't get on the bandwagon, we are going to find ourselves open to more compliance risk with the regulators themselves. So we can look no further than ICH E6R3, guidelines and guidance from the EMA and FDA as well. The regulators themselves are shifting focus. They're no longer looking at our final polished document at the end of the trial. They are also now looking at the process that created it. They are inspecting our systems governance. They are looking at our audit trails. They are looking at how we transfer things from one place to another. So that brings us squarely to Alcoa Plus, which in the TMF world we'll all be very familiar with. And that's our framework for data integrity. So we all know the acronym, and it's on the slide here as well. But the two specific letters I want to focus on are contemporaneous and consistent. So the two C's there. If a document is finalized at an investigator's site, but it takes 3 weeks of manual email chains and uploads before the document is visible in the TMF, can we really consider that data contemporaneous? It's not. And it's just not. And if the metadata attached to an amendment, so a protocol amendment, if that varies between the CRO's active workspace and then the sponsor's final repository, is that data truly consistent? Absolutely not. So when we rely on broken manual data exchange, and if you are still doing so today, you are introducing inspection risk, or you already have introduced inspection risk. You essentially risk the loss of context of your data and the breaking of an audit trail during a system transfer. And you could be in a position where you will fail to prove you've got the appropriate system oversight as well. The regulators expect us to be proactive in our governance. They want to see that there is control over the data lifecycle from the moment of inception to the moment of final archive. So interoperability of our systems, the choices we make, it's not just a strategy here that makes our lives easier, even though it does, obviously do that. It is becoming now the only viable way to meet the modern regulatory standards for data integrity. Now, it's great that we can understand these regulatory standards and what the expectations are, and I guess the pressures that they put upon us. But meeting them with our current day-to-day tools is another. So now let's have a look at where our existing data exchange methods are cracking under the pressure, shall we say, and struggling to keep up with those needs. So let's expose some of the actual gaps in how our systems exchange data today, and hopefully some of this will be relevant and you'll relate to, and hopefully nod in the background too as well. The industry standard for transferring TMF data from a CRO to a sponsor, for example, right now is what I affectionately call the export to zip nightmare. A milestone gets hit or a study wraps up and the CRO extracts a massive multi-gigabyte zip file and ships it over to the sponsor. Now, on the surface, that looks like it's a fairly clean handoff. But the moment the sponsor unzips that file, they will then fall into what I consider a reconciliation black hole. And why do I say that? Well, because every vendor has their own interpretation of the folder structures, the naming conventions, the metadata tagging. So your study team is potentially then forced to sit down and manually map folder A from vendor 1 to your own internal corporate TMF structure, or where your end of study TMF is going to land up. And that's a very slow, resource-heavy exercise and involves a lot of manual data entry. And while us humans are wonderful at clinical strategy, we are notoriously bad at repetitive data entry. We introduce errors, we misclassify, we lose critical context. Worse yet, this approach hits what I call the scalability wall. So if you're a small biotech running one small localized study with one CRO, you could probably brute force your way through this manual reconciliation. But what happens when you start to scale? What happens when you have 5 trials, 10 trials, 25 trials, each utilizing a mix of specialized different vendors, ePro systems, central labs, local labs? You can't scale if your primary strategy for data integration is throwing more bodies into something that is actually a technology and software problem. So that current methodology of batch disconnected file transfers, to me, is completely broken, and it's holding our timelines somewhat hostage. So to break through this wall, we need to have a look at a better blueprint, one that is built on modern technology standards, APIs that are more standardized to connect systems and allow those systems to connect directly without the need for too much manual intervention for every single study. And in order to do that, we need some strong pillars to really build upon. So our clinical architecture needs to be built on pillars that really are considering true interoperability, universal data standards, and those sort of structured APIs that I refer to. So let's talk about standards first and foremost. We made a massive leap years ago with the CDISC, or what was the TMF reference model, and now the CDISC TMF reference model. It gave us that common vocabulary. It defined what a protocol is, it defined what an investigator CV is, it defined a regulatory submission and what that should look like across the industry. And that was hugely foundational. But having a common vocabulary only works if the systems are actually talking to each other in a way that can use that common vocabulary. And so that's where we have our second pillar, modern secure APIs. We need to move away from those old school batch file transfers and move towards more event-driven data movement. A lot of vendors can already do this. Others need to catch up. It's really upon you as the industry to force the vendors, to push the vendors to say, we need this. The more you do, the more they have to come to the table in order to provide you with the ability to do this, because otherwise you're just going to choose another vendor to work with that can help you fulfill that need. So in our truly interoperable ecosystem where systems can talk to each other directly, a coordinator can finalize an essential document in an ISF at the site, and then that should trigger, a call to the related system, and it can put, which is the TMF. It can push that document along with a complete authenticated metadata set, and it can push directly into the sponsored TMF. No manual downloading, no emailing, no drag and drop. Systems are doing the work that we historically and still are doing ourselves and manually. And so in this architecture now, the metadata becomes our source of truth. The documents themselves are a static pixels, really, but it's the metadata that goes with them. Site numbers, country codes, artifact IDs, dates of approval. That's what drives the automation between all of our systems. If our systems are sharing that standardized metadata structure and they're able to communicate in a standardized way using these APIs, that need for us to do manual mapping disappears entirely. The data can flow more cleanly, more accurately, more instantly, and that creates this idea of a unified clinical ecosystem where information is moving at the same speed as the science. The future TMF standard that's coming is going to go one step further to help address some of this. And it's exactly what we need to support this idea of true interoperability that then should not cost thousands and thousands of pounds and dollars. Now, to make this communication work seamlessly across the different software vendors, the industry needs a unified mechanism to package this data as well, which brings us to another evolution that came after the TMF reference model and will continue to evolve as a concept as well, and that is the EMS, or the Exchange Mechanism Specification. So if you're not aware of this, I'll use this slide to explain a little bit about what this is. So whilst the TMF reference model is our structure and standard for the nomenclature, and APIs are there as our mechanism of transport. What we actually realized was we were still missing a standardized way to package everything to transport the TMF between entirely different software platforms. So that's where the EMS, or the Exchange Mechanism Specification, was formed. So before the EMS even existed, if two different systems were both using the TMF reference model as a taxonomy, the actual mechanism of transferring that data was still very unique every time. Every vendor had their proprietary format for the export. So if you wanted to move your TMF from vendor A to vendor B, it required some sort of custom integration between those two vendors. That can be quite costly. It's quite brittle in a sense, and it can break. So we can think of the EMS as the universal shipping container for our TMF data. So it doesn't matter what's inside the container. It doesn't matter what's inside the container, and it doesn't actually matter which truck or ship is carrying it. The container itself is built to an exact, universally accepted standard, much like actual shipping containers that you see around the world. So the EMS actually defines how files, how metadata, and crucially, our historic audit trails must be packaged together during the exchange of the TMF between multiple systems. And that is vital for our compliance. So in the past, the migration of data often meant we would lose audit trail or have it detached from the document itself, which makes inspectors' lives even more difficult and therefore puts pressure on you. The EMS ensures that we have the complete lifecycle history of every document and record, and it travels with that document or record in a standardized, machine-readable format. For life science organizations, the EMS is a declaration of independence to an extent. It eliminates proprietary lock-in to any one vendor. It means you can more seamlessly transfer your TMF content between different active systems. So you can transfer it out of a CRO system into your own if you're the sponsor without sacrificing compliance, but you can also then use it to get into an archive model as well for that long-term archiving. And with that, you're not sacrificing compliance, you're not losing data integrity, and you're not having to pay astronomical custom integration fees for the two systems to talk to each other. It's essentially a technical foundation that makes data flow more seamless in a reality. So if we've now established this structured, standardized data flow, so we've got this foundation of the reference model and metadata standard. So the actual taxonomy is the same. We've now got a standardized way to package and share data across systems. Now we can think about how do we start to layer on more advanced capabilities like artificial intelligence to add automation and quality control directly into this process. So we can't talk about modern data flow and product management without talking about AI anymore. So if we step past the huge marketing hype that we see every day right now, let's focus on the practical reality of where artificial intelligence can deliver measurable value for our trial master file workflows today. I do want to make a point, though, that putting AI in place on our legacy systems and processes is not the right thing. There is a common phrase used in software development, and it's been used for years and years when we started moving from paper into digital systems, which is garbage in, garbage out. If the foundations on which you're building are garbage, they're not sort of considerate of what you need to have as you make these evolutions and step changes, then the net result that you're going to get is not going to be great either. And it's the same about as we start to layer artificial intelligence in. If we're layering artificial intelligence on top of bad quality data and bad foundations, then the results you get from it are not going to be great. So just bear that in mind as you consider your foray into sort of AI. But also, AI is not a replacement for human oversight, and the regulators will tell you this as well. AI can act as an intelligent traffic cop, shall we say, sitting within your interoperable data streams, but it's not replacing us as humans. There still needs to be human in the loop in all of our processes, and the regulators expect that entirely. But if you've got data now flowing from one system to another, you can now layer in things like machine learning models that can sort of inspect your incoming records in more real time. We can use natural language processing to read the actual text of a document, verify where its classification. It can check that something that's labeled as an investigator CV is actually a CV. It can confirm some of the other metadata automatically. And AI can also enable more intelligent metadata extraction. It can read documents and extract relevant metadata like names, expiration dates, site numbers, auto-populating fields without any one human needing to type a single character. Now, this requires those foundations to be in place, the standards between the source systems and the end system, so i.e. your TMF, and then ultimately your end of study archive solution as well. But if you have that in place, then AI can be used to do some of the things that we've been doing manually for so many years. But in my view, the most profound impact that we'll find with artificial intelligence when we think about our records management is in more proactive automated quality control. So traditional QC is happening weeks and sometimes months after documents are uploaded. And it's happening in the different systems as well. And AI can shift our QC to the point of entry. It can look at incoming records, instantly detect, for example, if a signature block is blank, if a date is mismatched, if a page is missing. It can flag those errors, the exact time that the data is actually coming in. This transforms our QC process from being a reactive retrospective rescue mission into something that's more proactive, more real time, and essentially, therefore, our AI is an automated gatekeeper. With this as well, it also requires us to think about all of us and our roles in the clinical trial life cycle. So I'm sure that you've witnessed expensive software rollouts failing. And even you may have even started to use AI today and be seeing mixed results potentially. We hear the term of hallucinations from AI, where it's seeing things that you know are not really there. And that's because we can sometimes simply force our old habits into the new way we want, in the new systems and the new technology. And that is ultimately on us, the human, because we're so used to the way we've done things. But the true interoperability that we need, it requires robust business processes and change management. So if we are going to automate our data flows, if we are going to introduce AI-driven features to achieve a huge reduction in our administration burden, our roles as people have to evolve as well. So ultimately, we want to shift our TMF teams away from being document filers, people who spend their days manually typing in metadata and uploading documents from one place to another, to becoming AI orchestrators and data managers who look at the confidence that is being generated from the automated processes and are there to handle exceptions. We've also got to dismantle our siloed mentalities, where clinical operations, regulatory affairs, data management view the TMF as someone else's responsibility. Everybody has to own the data feeds from their respective systems, which ultimately all will feed into our trial master files. To build up or to build this level of intelligence, automation, to empower all of our people to focus on the higher value task. It brings up a critical architecture question, though. And that is, where do I get the technology from? What's the right model for me? What can I afford? Do I go to a single vendor? Do I buy standards-led best-of-breed systems and try and fit them together? So what are those choices, and what is the dilemma that I have to go through in order to figure this out? So as a technology leader in an organization, but also as a business functional lead as well, you're going to find yourself at strategic crossroads at different points of your scaling life cycle. It's the classic debate of single vendor versus best of breed. The single vendor solution is an attractive solution. It's an attractive illusion sometimes. The sales pitch is simple. Buy all your modules from us, and all that integration is built in. In the real world, this can sometimes lead to compromised capabilities. Not all the time. So there are vendors that can say this and can actually prove that they can do this. But sometimes it can lead to some compromised capabilities. But also, you have to bear in mind that no single software vendor is going to be world-class at every stage of the clinical trial lifecycle. They might have an excellent TMF, but they might have a slightly rigid, unfriendly ISF or an outdated archiving solution. They're going to focus their technology investments in different areas. So you might find that one system is moving forward at a rate of knots and evolving and innovating, and others are not. So if you force your teams into that suite, you could end up sacrificing adoption and some operational speed just to get the idea or the concept of a native integration. Conversely, the old way of building best-of-breed systems was a historical nightmare. It resulted in a tangled mess of broken, custom, costly integrations. Today, because we have more mature data standards, like we have in the data management world from CDIS, like we have the TMF reference model, and as I've talked about now, more modern APIs, vendors building standardized connectors between their systems because we have mechanisms like the EMS, the paradigm has shifted. So we can now find ourselves more confidently able to choose the best of breed approach because it gives us more freedom, more operational agility, and we can select the best, most innovative tools for the specific functions that we need. Within data management, within ClinOps, within regulatory, you can use the tools that work best for you and your function, but at the same time, have the ability to interoperate across each other. And so because your ecosystem is built on more universal standards, which again need you to pressure the vendors to adhere to, you don't sacrifice as much control, compliance, and then have the costly integrations. The data can flow more seamlessly, and you can retain a bit more ownership of your data structure. So you're then not locked into a single vendor roadmap or subject to the price increase that they might have. You can then build a more agile ecosystem that moves at the speed of your business. Neither one is right or wrong. It just depends on your organization, the size of your organization, the expertise, the resources. Cost is obviously a huge factor as well. And so you really have to assess based upon your circumstances, which is the best one that's going to allow you to get to, this future state of more automated, less manually intensive processes that can leverage the right technology. But when we do pick the components that communicate with these open standards, it really will transform the trial life cycle for you, and it will transform what is essentially the final phase when we think about the TMF in particular, and allow us to become more archive ready by design. So this brings us to the ultimate destination for our seamless data flow, the long-term preservation and the archiving of that data. In most of our practices today, archiving is treated as an afterthought. I'm not saying that that's true for all of you, but in a lot of instances, it is somewhat a painful post-trial project. Our study ends, our database is locked, and then we have stressed out teams spending weeks and months trying to gather, reconcile, clean, and package years worth of clinical data into an archive. We've already talked about how inefficiencies of manual processes. We've talked about how it's prone to data loss. We've talked about how it can risk and delay things like study closure. If we can think about making sure that we have this data-driven mindset, we are thinking about the technology standards, we're enabling our teams to adopt them, and we are looking at our vendors to provide us with a standards-led architecture, we can shift our paradigm. We can transition ourselves from reactive archiving to being archive-ready by design. And by connecting our TMF to our archiving solutions, like that Arkivum offer, using more automated standard-based pipelines, we can move towards this not being a final milestone. We can instead think about this being a continuous background non-event throughout the entire life cycle of the trial. As documents are finalized and validated by your AI gatekeepers, no longer document handlers, and your active systems during the study flow, then they can more cleanly and automatically flow into your long-term archiving solutions more actively. The complete metadata structure gets preserved, the audit trails are locked down securely, and long-term digital preservation protocols are beginning immediately rather than right at the end. This can ensure your data is more fully compliant, it's secure, and more importantly, it's readable and accessible for the next N number of years that you need it per what the regulations require us to do, regardless of how then technology changes or when legacy systems get retired. You're not going to then have to be spending weeks and weeks and months at the end formatting files for preservation because your data is already archived. It's already archived correctly. The system was designed to think about the archiving at day one. Eliminate the end of study reconciliation bottleneck, and suddenly you are more inspection ready throughout the life cycle of the study, and therefore inspection readiness is not an activity that happens when you become aware of an incoming inspection. It is a standard state of your day-to-day lives. This is the ultimate power of true interoperability. It is where we are going. It's where technology is now starting to take us. So really, let's look at now, how do we take some of these insights back into our respective organizations? How can we put some of this into action? So really, to conclude for today, I'd like to leave a little bit of a mandate with you, and that fragmentation of your data is an operational choice, and it's not just driven by a regulatory requirement. We have data standards today, we have APIs, we have systems being able to talk to each other. We do have artificial intelligence capabilities already available to shatter what was a bottleneck for the TMF. So these things are there today, and they are continually now evolving and innovating. So my call to action for today is twofold. Number one is stop accepting the status quo from your technology partners. Challenge them, push them, demand, audit your current ecosystem, and demand APIs that are standardized between systems. Reject the proprietary data silos and make compliance with standards such as the EMS, more non-negotiable requirements that you have of your vendors, especially in your selection process if you're considering changing systems. Push your vendors to open up their platforms so the data can move more freely. If you don't demand, if you don't ask, then the vendors are less compelled to have to do that for you. And being a vendor myself, it's interesting that I have this mindset of asking you to push, but I truly believe that you should have the choice to select which vendor is right for you, which situation in your organization, and that it is incumbent on us to find a way to help you have your data flow more seamlessly. Secondly, I urge you to shift left in your strategic planning. So don't leave the long-term preservation and archiving discussions to the end of the trial life cycle. At that time, your teams are exhausted enough from running the trial, and therefore we want I want you to think about addressing long-term archiving at the very beginning, during study startup, during the protocol design phases, and then be building and considering the pipelines that you need to ensure that the data is archive ready by the way that you've designed the data collection and flow. And if you are then executing correctly in terms of the interoperable standards that you need, your TMF will transform from a stressful administrative burden into something that is more streamlined, more automated, and a highly reliable asset. So let's really stop spending our time on, in our valuable time, babysitting static files, and let's start managing dynamic data ecosystems. By doing so, we can reduce our timelines, we can eliminate operational friction, and we can keep our focus entirely on what matters most, which is accelerating the delivery of innovative therapies to patients around the globe. So with that, I thank you for joining this session this morning. I'm looking forward to taking any questions that you have, and I hope you enjoy the rest of ArkFest as well. Thank you very much.
That's great, Ricky. Thank you very much indeed. Really insightful, and as always, and thank you very much indeed. I guess there's a personal interest in this, but there is also a question that when we talk about archive ready by design, how aware are people, do you think, of their obligations for retaining essential clinical records, the timelines? Obviously there's been some recent updates to the MHRA guidelines, for example. And also that notion of starting with the end in mind. How often do you think that people consider the retention and management of records at the beginning of a study startup to ensure they are inspection ready?
I think it's still very low right now. In my experience and the customers that I work with, the focus is very much on kind of the here and now. I have a study, I'm starting up a study, I need a trial master file, I need a clinical trial management system, I need to, and then the focus really is on how do I get my teams doing the job that they need to do in terms of execution of the trial, and executing that in the most efficient and seamless way. And I'm still seeing that the end point is a milestone. The archival piece is a milestone that's in your trial management plan, but is not being considered till much later on, because you're so focused on startups, finding the sites, enrolling patients and hitting those initial milestones. So I still think it's a challenge that the experts within the industry, us as vendors that live in this part, we need to do more to help educate our customers and newer biotechs and CROs and med device companies that are starting up to think about that endpoint. Because if you don't, when you get to the end, you're gonna find that you've got this web of data that you have to untangle to make archivable. In terms of the timelines and obligations as well, as you say, there've been some recent changes. Again, I think most people know on the surface level what the top level expectations are, but I don't know if there's a true understanding of what that means to boots on the ground. So what do I actually have to do in order to meet that obligation, and what am I going to be required to do? What's the level of effort? What are the things that I need to think about functionally with my people, with my systems? So I do think there's a continued education that needs to happen to ensure that the true, I guess, the level of effort, the level of work that's needed in order to meet the regulatory requirements for long-term data preservation is understood at the beginning, so that you don't end up keeping it as an afterthought.
Okay, great, thank you. I really liked your slide that talked about this blueprint of interoperability with REST APIs, kind of the CDISC reference model, and that contextual standardized metadata piece. In your opinion, how many organizations have cracked the transfer of data? And what advice can you provide to organizations to help them actually communicate these requirements to the vendors to
Mhm.
get those kind of some of those standards put in place? Because I take your point, it's down to, there needs to be more voices towards the vendors saying this is
Mhm.
what we need. How can people do that? If you're a vendor, what's the
Mm.
most suitable way of people doing that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the reference model itself, in terms of adoption, is it's almost a no-brainer. There isn't, not an eTMF system out there that doesn't support the reference model. You won't get off the ground as a vendor if you don't. It is kind of the default standard that you need. The exchange is a different kettle of fish, and in my experience, there's a mixed bag of support right now. I'm aware of a handful of vendors that do support the EMS in its original. I'm not saying, I'm not saying the EMS is perfect, because it's only had in its sort of early versions, and then needs to evolve and change itself. But I'm only aware of a handful of vendors that have sort of said that they can support EMS as a method of exchange, and at varying levels as well, in terms of, can they extract the container and build the container, but then can they automate the flow of that container, i.e. put it on the ship as well and get it to its one port to another. So there is definitely more that needs to happen. And what I'm seeing right now is that there is a drive from the vendors. So I'm not sure how many people on the webinar are aware, but as part of the CDISC TMF sort of standards committee, there are different working groups, and there is a vendor working group, and pretty much all of the TMF vendors that you'd expect to see are on that working group, and we are all involved in the new TMF standard, providing our feedback, as well as then considering, well, how do we then interoperate as well. But I think what it also needs is, if you are a customer and you have a TMF and you have a vendor, you need to ask the questions of your vendor as to, like, what do they support, how do they support it, and especially if you're a sponsor that works with a CRO, you need to be asking your CRO, are you using a vendor that can output in a standardized way that will then talk to the system that I am using. So as you are going to CROs and vetting CROs and doing RFPs, it should be a question. How do you collect and then output the TMF, such that if I want to put it in my own TMF, I don't have to go through this costly process. I don't have to receive a zip file and download it from some FTP. And how do you get my TMF to my long-term archive as well, right? And so I think if it has to become something that, as the customer speaking to the vendors, or as the sponsor speaking to the CROs, you're making it an absolute table stake requirement to say, I need you to support these standards, because it's the only way I can get my data to where I need it to be, to have oversight, to be inspection ready, to be archive ready as well.
Great, fantastic. I mean, it sounds as though PharmaSeal are very much subscribe to the notion of avoiding vendor lock-in, as do Arkivum, I have to say. How common is that across vendors, do you think, or are vendors kind of keen to maintain an element of lock-in? It's kind of a balance, right?
It is, and it's tough, because as a vendor, if you want to, as you try and scale, you might try and then start to add more systems to your portfolio to help you scale and be more competitive. But I definitely think in the small mid-market region area, that the vendors that operate in that space, they are very much specialists in what they do. And so this idea of a partner network, which is kind of the philosophy that we have at PharmaSeal, we consider ourselves experts in clinical operations. We don't consider ourselves the experts in other bits. So we operate with this partner network to say, well, here's an ecosystem of partners that we work with. We try and be as open as possible, so we don't try and lock into any one vendor in any space. But we try and be open to say, well, look, you pick what's best for you, and we will work with that vendor to make sure that you've got that seamless operational data flow between the systems. And I think I'm seeing more and more of that now, especially in the SME space. Obviously, as you go up to the larger organizations, for big, sponsors, CROs, having a one-stop shop is much easier from an overall management and to get more efficiencies across the board. And so you will still see the larger vendors who kind of have that sort of lock-in mindset. But if you're a small sponsor working with a slightly larger CRO, you'll need that larger vendor to be open to anyway to get you your data, because it's ultimately your data that you have to have oversight with, that you have to defend in an inspection. So it gives you the ability to challenge even the larger organizations and the larger vendors to have some level of openness to support your needs.
Absolutely. Okay, that's great. Ricky, again, thank you very much indeed. A really, really insightful presentation. And yeah, really good and solid content that's, I think, so relevant to all of the audience today. So thank you very much indeed for that.
Thank you for having me.
In terms of, I'd just like to remind everyone, obviously, this was the first of today's Pharma Track, and we were delighted to have Ricky on board with us today. Following this one is Cornelia Baumgardner, and it's suitable to the ICH E6R3 piece you were talking about earlier on, Ricky, because she'll be talking about 1 year on how has ICH E6R3 shaping clinical operations and data management. So please do join us for the next session, and obviously the rest of the day we've got lots of other sessions going as well. So I'd just like to say thank you once again to you, Ricky, and thank you on behalf of both Arkivum and all of the attendees today. It's been a really good presentation. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.